Paul concludes Romans 9 by drawing a sharp contrast between two groups. The Gentiles, who had not pursued righteousness through the law of Moses, obtained righteousness because they believed the good news concerning Jesus Christ. Israel, however, zealously pursued righteousness through the law, but failed to attain it because they sought it through works rather than faith. The issue was never that God's promises had failed. The problem was not with the law itself, but with the people's confidence in their own obedience. The law was holy, just, and good, yet it was never designed to produce righteousness through human effort. Instead, it exposed sin and pointed forward to the Messiah. Paul explains that Israel stumbled over the stumbling stone. This was not because Christ was difficult to understand, but because many expected acceptance with God through covenant privilege, religious tradition, and obedience to the law. When Jesus appeared as the fulfillment of God's promises, many rejected him because his message required faith rather than reliance upon the works of the law. Chapter 10 continues this thought. Paul expresses his heartfelt desire for the salvation of his fellow Israelites. Their zeal for God was genuine, but it lacked understanding. They were devoted to the scriptures, the temple, and the commandments, yet they failed to recognize that everything these things anticipated had arrived in Christ. Seeking to establish their own righteousness, they refused to submit to the righteousness God freely provides. Human righteousness always falls short because it depends upon imperfect obedience. God's righteousness is received as a gift through faith in his Son. Paul then makes one of the defining statements of the epistle. Christ is the end of the law for righteousness to everyone who believes. This declaration does not merely mean that Christ brought the law to a stopping point. The word end also carries the idea of fulfillment, completion, and goal. Everything the law anticipated reached its intended purpose in him. The sacrifices, priesthood, festivals, covenant ceremonies, and commandments all pointed toward the work of Christ. Once he accomplished redemption through his death and resurrection, the law had fulfilled its purpose as the covenant governing God's people. Righteousness would no longer be found through adherence to that covenant, but through faith in the one to whom it always pointed. Paul's audience lived during the closing years of the Old Covenant age, when the gospel was being proclaimed throughout the nations, while many within Israel continued to cling to the Mosaic system. The conflict he describes was not between faith and moral living, but between two covenant realities, one centered on the law given through Moses, and the other centered on the finished work of Christ. Believers no longer stand before God on the basis of commandments written on stone, but upon the completed obedience of Jesus Christ. His righteousness is counted to those who believe, giving them full acceptance before God apart from the works of the law. This passage also reveals the consistency of God's saving purpose. From beginning to end, salvation rests upon his grace rather than human achievement. Faith is not another work added to the law, but the means by which believers receive what Christ has already accomplished. Romans 9, verse 30 to 10, verse 4, therefore marks a decisive transition from the old covenant system of righteousness through the law to the new covenant reality of righteousness through Christ. The believer's confidence rests entirely in him, for he has fulfilled every requirement necessary to bring his people into perfect standing before God.